Welcome to Redressing History, a podcast. This series seeks to foreground the work of African diaspora researchers whose work and histories are currently underrepresented and often overlooked in publications, academia, museums, and the media. This podcast was sponsored by the University of Brighton's Centre for Design History and the university's Equality and Inclusion Fund. My name is Kate Debono, and today I will be speaking to Dr Christine Checinska about her experience as an African diaspora curator and researcher. We will be discussing her research into Caribbean fashion and dress histories, collecting practices, and the curatorial role. Christine is curator of African and African diaspora fashion at the Victoria and Albert Museum. She's an artist, curator, and writer who worked as a fashion designer before moving into academia and curating. She studied fashion and textile design at the University of the West of England, graduating with a BA in 1986, fashion and communication at the University of the Creative Arts, earning an MA in 2002, and her PhD Colonising in Reverse, the creolised aesthetic of the Windrush generation, was awarded by Goldsmiths College, Centre for Cultural Studies, the University of London, in 2009. Between 2013 and 2015, she was postdoctoral fellow at the University of East London and the Stuart Hall Library animator at Innova, London, where she created the Clothes, Cloth and Culture Group. She has also been a research associate in visual identities in art and design at the University of Johannesburg and an associate lecturer in fashion at Goldsmiths. Christine's work is situated at the meeting point between contemporary art, fashion, and textiles. She writes about the relationship between cloth, culture, and race. Recurring themes in her work are the cultural exchanges that occur as a result of movement and migration, creating creolized and hybridized cultural forms, and the ongoing correlation between personal history and received social history is also an ongoing interest. Her publications include Social Fabric in the Handbook of Textile Culture, edited by Jan Jeffries, Hazel Clark, and Diana Wood Conroy. Crafting Difference, Art, Cloth, and the African Diasporas in Cultural Threads, Transnational Textiles Today, edited by Jessica Hemmings. Second Skins, Cloth, Difference, and the Art of Transformation in Image and Text, edited by Leora Farber and Anne-Marie Tully. And Reconfiguring Diasporic Identities in Beyond Borders, edited by John Hudnick. So Christine is currently working on the major exhibition, Africa Fashion, at the V&A. Welcome, Christine, and thank you for finding the time to speak to me. I'd like to start by finding out a bit more about your research and how it feeds into your curatorial practice.
Thank you. Well, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Kate. So my own research considers the relationship between fashion, culture and race, and it does so from the perspective of global African diasporas. One of the things that inspires me is the teasing out of hidden narratives, whether that's in public or private archives. So I'm really interested in people and things, the things that we use, the things we customize, the things we make, and our relationship to them. And I think I'm also inspired by the power of creativity to transform and, what happens when cultures come together, when they clash, when they coalesce to create new forms, new creolized forms. So in fact, a lot of my research before coming to the V&A was rooted in the Caribbean. And now, of course, with Africa Fashion, it's been extended to the African continent itself. So I think that it comes through in the curatorial practice because I am really interested in this idea of whether it's creolization or bringing together many different cultural forms to create something new, which is something that we see in the African fashion scene, which is always changing. You can't really define it. It is many things. There are many different aesthetics. So this is one of the strands of the story of Africa fashion that I'll tell through the exhibition.
Would you like to tell me a little bit about the exhibition that's coming up, Africa Fashion?
The V&A are planning a major exhibition celebrating the irresistible creativity, ingenuity, and unstoppable global impact of the contemporary African fashion scene. I'm lucky enough to be leading that exhibition project. We'll be opening in June 2022, and we want to celebrate the vitality and innovation of this scene, which is as dynamic and varied as the African continent itself.
How do you define the curatorial role?
Yes, I think as curators, we build and care for museum collections, but we also share those collections. And I always feel conscious that museum collections, they're not just about objects, they're about the stories around them. And so a lot of my role currently, what shapes it, what defines it, or what frames it, are these conversations that I have constantly, whether that's with members of the public that might have objects that we're interested in, or the fashion creatives on the continent who we might want to loan a garment for or purchase a garment from. So it's this combination of collecting, caring for, and sharing. And I think in the sharing, this is where we can bring something new to light for members of the public in the way that we mix the pieces from our collections together in our exhibitions or our public programs. And I often think that curators are rather like mixologists, like these cocktail people that sort of bring things together and shed new light on things because of the way that we bring seemingly random sometimes things together to tell a story. So we shed new light on things and share that with the public.
Fantastic, thank you. My research looks at the acquisition process and the role of the curator in and how they are present and how important they are in influencing what does and doesn't get collected. So how would you say that your identity as a Black British woman and a child of Caribbean migrants intersects with your role as a curator at the V&A?
Well, my role was actually created to extend our holdings to incorporate creativity and objects from Africa and the African diaspora. So I have the remit to extend our holdings. So I think when I come into work and I'm sort of performing my role as a curator, I'm bringing to it my integrated self. So yes, I'm bringing my academic mind, I'm bringing my artistic background, but I'm also drawing on my knowledge of lived experience within the African diaspora. So it's, for me, it feels like a wonderful kind of flowering, if you like, where I can actually bring my whole integrated self and the broad vocabulary of influences that have been built up over the years, creatively, academically, and also through my own sort of extended network within the diaspora.
So I first became aware of your role at the V&A when I read Vanessa Friedman's article, The Incredible Whiteness of Museum Fashion Collection, in the New York Times, which was published September last year, so 2020. And Friedman's article presents that really stark reality of the really limited nature of what has been acquired by what she terms the small group of high culture institutions that venerate the art of fashion, and the impact this has had on culture and the fashion industry and on individuals. So would you say that your role at the V&A is impacting on collecting practices of that institution in a wider way? And in what ways do you see this happening?
Yes, I absolutely think so. Because I think there's definitely within the museum a great sort of swell of feeling and determination and commitment to extending the holdings. So I do feel that there's tremendous support and there is an ambition to better represent Africa and its diasporas across the board, not just in fashion and textiles. But in doing so, I think we're also very mindful of not shying away from our historical collections, not shying away from our historical ways of acquisition and telling stories around objects. So my role is in part about reanimating the holdings that we do have, but then also collecting the contemporary and looking for new objects or new acquisitions that will tell a broader story about a broader we, if you like, that incorporates everyone and doesn't leave certain cultures out.
It's really nice to hear that sort of reanimating as well side of things.
Oh yes, there's definitely a kind of a looking back as well as a moving forward, which I think is really important.
So in Friedman's article, you are quoted as saying you can't undo 100 years of miscategorization and undervaluation overnight. So my next question is sort of around the same sort of ideas, but how are you negotiating these issues of categorization, classification and nomenclature in your current role?
That's a great question, because I think arriving in the museum just over a year ago, I found that work was already being done, and fantastic work was already being done around this idea of categorization. So we have a group called the Terminologies Group, where there are a group of curators and other interested parties that go through the collection and sort of think about what terminology are we using? Is it outmoded? And it's not to kind of hide sort of outmoded terminology. It's more about setting the context for outmoded terminologies and then revising those terminologies. I think as far as Africa Fashion is concerned, we very much are creating this project with Africa at its centre. So I think I mentioned earlier about the conversations that I've been having since joining the museum. So we're very keen to give a platform for the fashion creators on the continent to represent their work in the way that they want it represented. So coming into the exhibition, you'll be able to sort of experience their voices and see their voices or hear their voices. And so I think with contemporary museum practice, there is this acknowledgement that expertise comes in many different forms. So yes, it can be the person that has, studied the sort of more classical route and come through museum studies, but also expertise is there in the hands and the minds of the practitioners themselves, or even in my case, in terms of the wearers. So this recognition of the different forms of expertise. So for Africa Fashion, I'm working really closely. I have been working closely actually already with a youth collective. So we have a team of young people of colour that we sort of bounce idea off, and they're invited to share their thoughts on what we're doing as well in a very open and transparent way. And similarly, we've just recruited a community panel, which is more intergenerational. Once again, all sort of with African and African diaspora heritage, but again, recognizing that expertise comes in many forms. How do we want to represent ourselves? What terminology would we use to describe an Iro, for example? We wouldn't say a rapper, we would say Iro. So, it's really being mindful of going back to the source, really, in some ways, is what we're doing.
I've really enjoyed Peter Hall's session's discussion about can museums be decolonised? And I think that's something that came really strongly through that discussion was it really matters who's involved in the collecting, who's involved with the collection. And it's nice to hear that sort of coming through right up into your work at the V&A. Sort of, it matters.
Absolutely. And I think this whole idea of kind of centering Africa in this project, and in my previous projects, I've kind of centered the Caribbean. So it's sort of looking at the world from the point of view of the African continent. And so then you kind of automatically start to challenge terminology. You automatically start to push against boundaries and boxes, and you automatically begin to inhabit this world of a kind of broader we, if you like.
With regards to the undervaluation of African and African diaspora fashion, do you think things are finally changing with how it's been valued?
I do. I absolutely do. I mean, I was sharing just recently with a friend that when I first started doing my research into African diaspora dress, and I was trying to work out the number of years, but it's close to 20 years ago. It's maybe between 15 and 20 years ago. And I remember sort of saying to someone that I was really interested and fascinated about the idea of finding out about the dress of the enslaved. And I rang a national museum, and the voice on the other end of the line laughed when I said, "Oh, this is what I want to research." And I don't think that would happen today. So I think things are definitely moving in the right direction. Yes, there's more to do, but I just think that now I feel that there's an openness to these kinds of research projects. And I think that people understand that one has to approach them in a creative way because, these stories, these histories, these narratives have been missing, they've been hidden. So I think there's room for creativity when it comes to research. And I think there is an openness in terms of research projects. There's some fantastic work in the States, for example, being done by the Fashion and Race Database, who are busy sort of collating everyone's research internationally and globally on this topic, just so that students and people, interested parties have somewhere to go to access the research that's already been done. So I think that these sorts of networks are really key. And I feel that there's a new phase, I think, that we're entering with this kind of research and this kind of museum collecting and curating. one of the things that's been really important to me about our process with Africa Fashion, I think I mentioned about centering Africa and speaking with the creators on the continent, but we launched the project quite early for the V&A. We launched in January with a public call out for objects, because we're really passionate that this is a people's exhibition, if you like. So we really wanted the voice, the attitudes, the fashioning of the wearers to be part of the exhibition. And it's been an absolute joy working in this way, to invite the public to share their stories around fashion. And with the starting point for the exhibition is the independence era. So it's the African independence era. So it's all about agency, abundance, self-fashioning, and, you know, this zest for life that comes through in the clothing of that period, and how it then recurs in what we see as this vibrant scene today.
It's sort of starting to think about how I'm coming to this as well from my research, which I started off looking at non-elite dress in 20th century fashion collections, which was something I struggled to find when I was wanting to research everyday dress. So it's kind of brought me into that. And I was suddenly looking at things and went, well, there's no way to identify elite or non-elite, but there's all these other massive gaps that people just aren't there, that people aren't just represented. So it's led me down this kind of conversation about how people are collecting fashion in particular through the 20th and into the 21st century. So yeah, it's lovely to kind of see these different perspectives and to talk to curators yourself about how you're engaging with it.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I think that that's the joy really of working on something like everyday dress, because, you know, you can really be creative in terms of how you research it. And, you know, as I say, the stories around the objects are always so fascinating. You know, it's social history, but through clothes, really, isn't it?
And there's individual people as well. Sort of, I'm finding individual people in the clothes, individual people in the curators, and the people who worked alongside the curators, and the little influences they've had on collections throughout time.
Absolutely. I mean, it's quite. It's interesting. You know, I look through, you know, the notes, the catalogue entries, but the notes that don't make it into the catalogue entries, and then you sort of realise, well, actually, in 100 years' time, someone will be looking at, you know, our notes and thinking, okay. But it's interesting because I love that kind of behind the scenes, you know, seeing those hidden moments and the thought processes, you know, why certain things end up being collected and others don't. And I think one of the other exciting things about Africa Fashion is it gives us the opportunity to show some of the indigenous fabrics that were collected by the circulation department in the 1960s that haven't been showed before. So that's really thrilling. You know, you sort of open a drawer and pull out the most gorgeous prints and weaves that were collected, you know, in the middle of the last century, and to have the opportunity to tell new stories about them is a real joy. To find out more and then share them with the public is wonderful.
So thank you, Christine, for that fascinating insight into your research and your curatorial role on the Africa Fashion exhibition. And thank you for listening to the Redressing Histories podcast.